On the 5th of April, 1909, a newspaper in Phoenix ran a front-page story about a cave. Not a small cave. An underground complex, the article said, cut into the rock wall of the Grand Canyon, hundreds of feet above the Colorado River, running back nearly a mile into solid cliff. Inside it, the paper claimed, were corridors, chambers, a crypt with tiers where the dead had been laid in rows, copper instruments that had kept their edge for thousands of years, a seated idol with its legs crossed and a flower in its hands. And on the walls, writing that not one man on the expedition could read. The explorer who reported finding it was named G.E. Kincaid. The institution, he said, had funded the work was the Smithsonian. Today, the Smithsonian says it has no record of the man, no record of the professor who supposedly led the dig, and no record of the cave. The article is real. You can pull it from the archives yourself. Everything inside the article, they tell us, is not. Or so it has stood for more than 100 years. Because there is a second text, far older than that newspaper, older than the United States, older than Rome. And it also describes something buried in the earth. Chambers. Bound things. A prison sunk beneath the ground with a door that was never meant to open. That text was cut out of almost every Bible on the planet. It survived, whole and complete, in exactly one place on earth, a church in the mountains of Ethiopia. And what it describes underground lines up with the Grand Canyon account in ways that are very hard to explain away. And before we go further, I need to pause for a second, because what I'm about to tell you gets significantly darker, and I realized a while ago that some of this cannot be fully explained in a video format. The complete reconstruction of the Grand Canyon underground account, the exact chamber layout the explorer described, the Egyptian names carved onto that canyon's map, the original newspaper article, reprinted word for word from April 5th, 1909, I put it all into a written document, it's linked below and the QR code is on your screen. Now let's continue. Start with the book, because the book is the part almost nobody has actually read. The Bible you grew up with, whether Catholic, Protestant, or Orthodox, is not the Bible the earliest believers carried. It is an edited version. Books were debated, kept, and removed across centuries of councils, and one of the books that did not survive that process in the West was the Book of Enoch. Enoch is old, not medieval old. The oldest fragments were found among the Dead Sea Scrolls at Qumran, written in Aramaic, and they date to roughly 2 centuries before Christ. 11 separate copies of Enoch turned up in those caves. 11. That is, more surviving copies than were found of most of the books that did make it into the Old Testament. This was not a fringe text on the edge of Jewish thought. People copied it, carried it, and quoted it. The New Testament itself quotes it directly. The book of Jude, still in your Bible today, lifts a prophecy straight out of Enoch and names Enoch as its source. The earliest church fathers knew it and argued about it. For a long stretch of the ancient world, Enoch was simply part of the furniture of Scripture, as familiar to a first-century reader as Genesis or Isaiah. And that is what makes its removal so strange. Books do not usually get buried because they are obscure. They get buried because they are dangerous. And the men who assembled the official canon in the West did not quietly forget Enoch. They engaged with it, wrestled with it, and decided it had to go. And then, over the following centuries, it disappeared from the Western canon. By the era of the great church councils, Enoch was already being pushed to the margins, and the men assembling the official scriptures left it out. In the Latin-speaking church, Jerome, the scholar who produced the Vulgate, dismissed it. Augustine argued its stranger passages should be read as allegory, not fact. The book was too specific, too physical, too willing to name things the church preferred to keep abstract. It described where the fallen were, how deep, and behind what kind of door. And a claim with coordinates is a claim someone can go looking for. One church refused to let it go. The Ethiopian Orthodox Tewahedo Church, cut off from Rome by geography and history, kept Enoch inside its scripture and never removed it. For over 1,000 years, the complete text of Enoch survived in Ge'ez, the ancient liturgical language of Ethiopia, in manuscripts kept in mountain churches and stone chapels. When a Scottish traveler named James Bruce finally carried Ge'ez copies back to Europe in the 1770s, Western scholars were reading the full book again for the first time in more than a millennium. More than a century later, an Oxford scholar named R.H. Charles produced the English translation that most people still quote today, and modern readers finally had, in their own language, the book the councils had cut. Sit with how narrow that thread was. For over 1,000 years, the survival of this entire text depended on a single church, in a single country, copying it by hand, in a language almost no outsider could read. If Ethiopia had let it go the way everyone else did, the Book of Enoch would be a rumor, a title and a footnote, a thing quoted once in Jude and lost forever after. Instead, it survived whole, and it survived specifically in the one place the rest of the world was not looking. The Ethiopian Bible had preserved what everyone else had thrown away, and it preserved every unsettling word of the prison beneath the ground. So, what does the preserved book actually say? The oldest section is called the Book of the Watchers, and it is not a gentle read. It describes a group of angelic beings, 200 of them, who descend from the sky onto the summit of Mount Hermon. The text calls them the Watchers. They take human wives. They father a race of hybrid giants, the text names the Nephilim, and crucially, they teach. They hand humanity knowledge it was not supposed to have. Metalworking and the making of weapons, the cutting of roots and the mixing of drugs. The reading of the stars and the signs of the sky. Cosmetics, sorcery, the working of silver and gold. And the book keeps a roster. It names them, one by one, and it ties each name to a specific piece of knowledge. Azazel taught the making of swords and knives, shields and breastplates, and the pulling of metal out of the ground. Barakel taught the reading of the stars. Kokabel taught the constellations. Chazakel taught the signs of the clouds. Shamsiel taught the signs of the sun, and Sariel the course of the moon. A later section of the book adds Penemu, who taught mankind to write with ink and paper, and it treats even literacy itself as a thing that was handed down rather than earned. Each name is bound to a domain the way you would tag entries in a ledger. Read that carefully, because it is easy to miss what kind of document this is. It is not describing vague temptation or generic sin. It is describing a transfer of technology, cataloged item by item, with a name attached to each line: metallurgy, weapons, astronomy, chemistry, writing. The book is arguing that the foundations of human civilization did not rise up from below. They were handed down from above by beings who were not supposed to hand them down, and who were punished for it. The leader of the metal and weapon teaching is named Azazel. And when judgment finally comes for the Watchers, the text does not say they were killed, it says they were bound. Chapter 10 of Enoch records the sentence in language that reads less like poetry and more like a warrant. The archangel Raphael is commanded to bind Azazel hand and foot, to cast him into the darkness, to make an opening in the desert and throw him into it, to cover him with jagged and sharp rocks, and to leave him there, in the dark, beneath the stones, until the day of judgment. A second leader, Shemihaza, who organized the descent, is sentenced separately. Michael is told to bind him and his followers beneath the hills of the earth for 70 generations, until the day their judgment is complete. Read that again slowly. Not destroyed, not erased, buried, contained, sealed under stone in a location the text is oddly willing to describe, and that is only the sentencing. Later in the book, Enoch is taken on a journey, and he claims to see the prison itself. Before we move on to the next passage, stop for a second. What you just heard about the binding of the Watchers is the part that changes everything, but it only makes sense when you see it written out next to the original Ge'ez passage, the names of the bound, the 70 generations. It's all in the document linked below. Take 5 seconds right now, grab it, and then come back, because what comes next builds directly on it. The link is in the description. QR code is on your screen. Now, the journey. In the middle chapters of Enoch, the patriarch is carried by angels to the far edges of creation, and he is shown places no living man was meant to see. He describes a great chasm, a gap in the earth with pillars of fire descending into it without end. He describes seeing 7 stars bound together, burning like great mountains, and he asks his guide why. The angel answers that these are the stars and the powers of heaven that transgressed, that did not come out at their appointed times, and so they are held in this place until an unimaginable stretch of time has passed. Then Enoch says he went further, to a place worse than the first, and here his description turns physical in a way that is genuinely strange for an ancient text. He describes a prison, a pit that has no floor he can measure, a depth beyond the depths he has already seen, filled with fire and with cold and with a darkness that is not natural. He describes it as a completed structure, a thing built and sealed, not a natural cave. And the beings held there are not human dead awaiting resurrection. Enoch is careful to separate those. Elsewhere, he describes hollow chambers in a mountain where human souls wait. This deeper prison is different. It is for the powers, for the ones who came down and taught and were bound for it. You may have heard a specific number attached to this prison, a claim that Enoch measured the depth at 70,000 leagues, deeper than the distance to the moon. Be careful with that. That precise figure is cleaner in the retellings than it is in the text itself, and I am not going to hand you a number the manuscript does not plainly give. What the manuscript does give, again and again, is the impression of a depth its author cannot reach the bottom of, a pit that keeps going past the places he has already been shown. The point is not a mile marker. The point is that a man writing before Christ describes a hole in the earth so deep it exhausts his ability to describe it, and insists that something is locked at the bottom of it. The text keeps returning to the same three ideas: depth that should not be describable by a man from the ancient Near East; structure, a built and bounded thing rather than a formless underworld; and a door, a boundary that holds them in and will hold until a fixed future moment and not one day longer. Enoch is not writing a myth about a shadowy land of the dead. He is describing, in the flat voice of a witness, a maximum security facility sunk into the crust of the planet. Now hold that image in your mind. Chambers cut into rock, a structure, not a cave. Statues of the bound, a sealed door. Because we are going back to Arizona, and to that newspaper story everyone was told to forget. The Arizona Gazette, the 5th of April, 1909. The headline reads that explorations in the Grand Canyon have revealed the mysteries of an ancient people. The article introduces G.E. Kincaid, described as an explorer and adventurer who had been traveling the Colorado River by boat. Kincaid, the paper says, noticed stains in the sediment high on the eastern wall of the canyon, climbed to them, and found the entrance to a tunnel driven back into the rock. What he described inside, and what the paper says a Smithsonian-backed team under a Professor S.A. Jordan later confirmed, does not read like the American Southwest at all. Kincaid, according to the paper, was no drifter. It presents him as a seasoned man who had photographed and explored the region for years, a careful witness rather than a fantasist. He said he had entered the tunnel alone, torch in hand, and followed it far enough to realize that whatever he had found was too large and too deliberate to be a natural formation. He reported carrying out a few relics and shipping them, and he said the Smithsonian then sent a properly outfitted team to work the site under Professor Jordan. A main passageway, the article claims, ran back into the cliff for nearly a mile, with hundreds of rooms branching off it like the ribs off a spine. Some of the side passages, it says, ran off at sharp angles for hundreds of feet before opening into vaulted chambers. The passages were cut with a precision the explorer could not account for, and the air inside, he claimed, stayed clean and breathable deep into the rock, as if the place had been built with ventilation in mind. There were chambers, the article calls granaries, still holding the residue of ancient seed. There was a room the paper describes as a crypt, with tiers cut into the walls, where mummified bodies had been laid in rows, wrapped in a dark fabric. There were copper tools and weapons, hardened by some process that had been lost, that had not corroded in all the centuries underground. There were tablets covered in hieroglyphics. The article goes further into the dark. It describes a great central chamber it calls a shrine, from which the side passages radiated out like spokes. It describes urns and cups of copper and gold, and it describes weapons of war, along with a yellow metal the writers would not commit to naming. It describes tablets of stone covered in symbols and hieroglyphics, and it describes, in one of its most unsettling lines, carvings of a serpent among the wall art, a motif that turns up again and again in the oldest stories of forbidden knowledge. And at the heart of the complex, the article describes an idol, a figure seated cross-legged, holding a lotus or lily flower in each hand, its face turned in a way the explorer compared to Egyptian and Eastern gods. The paper likens it, in the same breath, to the seated figures of the East and to the gods of the Nile. Around it, smaller carvings and symbols the men could not read. The article flatly states that the artifacts, the burial style, and the writing were not Native American. It uses the word Egyptian. It suggests, in 1909, in a Phoenix newspaper, that a civilization from the other side of the world had once lived and buried its dead a mile inside the wall of the Grand Canyon. Now here is where I have to be straight with you, because a good story that falls apart under one question is not worth your time. The Smithsonian Institution has stated, repeatedly, that it has no record of G.E. Kincaid, no record of a Professor S.A. Jordan, and no record of any such expedition or cavern. No academic follow-up was ever published. The exact location in the article is vague. Many careful researchers regard the whole piece as a tall tale, the kind of embroidered adventure story that early 20th century newspapers ran to sell copies. That is the responsible position, and you should hold it. But hold this next to it. The article is not a modern invention. It genuinely ran, on that date, in that paper, and it can be read today. Whoever wrote it, in 1909, chose to describe an underground complex of cut chambers, a sealed crypt of the dead, copper that would not rust, and an idol at the center, in a canyon on the far side of the earth from Egypt, and then there is the map. Because you do not need a lost newspaper to find Egypt in the Grand Canyon. You need a modern topographic map. Look at the names of the great stone formations that rise from the canyon floor, the buttes and pinnacles that geologists cataloged in the late 1800s and early 1900s. There is a formation named Isis Temple, for the Egyptian goddess of the dead and of rebirth. There is Osiris Temple, named for the Egyptian lord of the underworld and judge of the dead. There is Horus Temple. There is the Tower of Set, named for the Egyptian god of chaos and the desert. There is the Tower of Ra, the sun god. There is a formation called the Cheops Pyramid, after the pharaoh of the Great Pyramid at Giza, and it does not stop at Egypt. In the same stretch of canyon, the surveyors reached across the whole ancient world for their names. There is a Shiva temple and a Brahma temple and a Vishnu temple for the gods of India. There is a Buddha temple. There is a Zoroaster temple for the prophet of ancient Persia. Whoever named these formations was not thinking about cowboys and prospectors. They were standing at the rim of that canyon, looking down into it, and reaching, again and again, for the names of gods, temples, and the dead. These are official names. They are on the geological survey maps. The Egyptian cluster in particular, Isis, Osiris, Horus, Set, Ra, sits in the same region of the canyon where the 1909 article placed its cavern. The standard explanation is that the geologists who named them in the Victorian era were simply romantics with a taste for mythology, who looked at towering rock and reached for the grandest ancient names they knew. That is probably true. But it is a remarkable coincidence that the surveyors chose, from every mythology on earth, the specific gods of the Egyptian dead and the Egyptian underworld, and planted them on the map directly above the place. A newspaper claimed a chamber of mummies had been found. Now, put the two texts side by side. Not the myth against the newspaper, but the shapes of what each one describes. The Ethiopian Book of Enoch, preserved for over 1,000 years where the rest of the world could not touch it, describes beings that came down, taught forbidden knowledge, and were bound. It describes their prison as a built structure sunk to an impossible depth, sealed behind a door, waiting for a fixed day of release. It describes the bound as powers, not ordinary dead, held apart in their own deep chamber. The Grand Canyon account, and the map that sits over it, describes a cut structure sunk into rock, a sealed crypt, an idol of a seated figure, and a cluster of formations named for the gods of the underworld and the judgment of the dead. One is a witness account written before Christ. The other is a witness account written in 1909. And the middle term that connects them, the thing that makes them rhyme, is the idea that this planet holds sealed places, cut and structured, containing something that was put away on purpose and is meant to stay put away. Here is the reading that the believers make, laid out plainly, so you can weigh it. Enoch says the fallen were bound in the earth in described locations, under stone, until judgment. The Ethiopian church preserved that claim intact while the rest of the world buried the book. If any of Enoch's geography is real rather than symbolic, then somewhere on earth there are chambers that match the description. And in 1909, in a canyon whose stone towers already carried the names of the Egyptian dead, a newspaper printed a detailed account of exactly that kind of chamber, cut into rock, sealed, full of the dead and the symbols of the dead. Then the record went quiet. No expedition, no artifacts in any museum, no location anyone will confirm. Just a book that was almost erased, a newspaper that was almost forgotten, and a map still labeled with the gods of the underworld. There is one more detail worth sitting with. After April of 1909, the story simply stops. There is no follow-up article walking the claims back. No triumphant announcement of the artifacts arriving at a museum. No angry correction from the Smithsonian at the time. A newspaper printed a detailed, named, front-page account of an underground Egyptian city inside America's most famous canyon, and then the entire matter evaporated as if it had never been printed. Sensational hoaxes usually leave a trail, a retraction, a rival paper mocking it, a confession years later. This one left a single article and a silence. That silence is not proof of anything. But it is exactly the shape a real discovery would leave if someone decided it should never be discussed again. And it is also exactly the shape a forgotten fib would leave if nobody cared enough to correct it. Two very different causes. One identical silhouette. Same picture, two different reasons behind the framing. You can read that quiet two ways. The ordinary way is that there is nothing to find. The article was a fable. The names on the map are Victorian whimsy, and Enoch's prison is theology dressed as geography. Every individual piece has an innocent explanation, and the responsible mind should accept them. That case is strong, and I am not going to pretend it isn't. But the other reading only requires you to notice one thing. It requires you to notice that the innocent explanations are all separate. The Smithsonian's denial explains the newspaper. The romantic geologist theory explains the map. The allegory theory explains Enoch. Each explanation handles one piece and hands the next piece to a different explanation. What none of them do is account for why the three pieces point at the same shape at the same time. A structure, cut into rock, sealed, holding the dead, or the bound, or the powers behind a door that is not supposed to open. The Egyptian dead on the map above it. And an ancient book saved by one church in the mountains, insisting the whole time that such places are real and were built for exactly this. Enoch ends his account of the prison the same way he begins it. The beings are bound. The door holds, and it holds only until an appointed time, a moment already fixed, after which the seal fails, and what was placed below is no longer below. He does not describe the release as a possibility. He describes it as a schedule. The Book of Enoch was removed from almost every Bible on earth. It survived in one church, in one language, in the mountains of a country most of the world overlooks. It describes a prison in the ground, cut and sealed, holding beings that came down and were put away. A newspaper on the far side of the world described a cut and sealed chamber in a canyon named for the Egyptian dead, and then that record went silent. The manuscripts are still in Ethiopia. The formations are still named on the map. The 1909 article is still in the archive, exactly as it was printed. The door Enoch describes is still, as far as anyone can prove, closed. None of these records was written to persuade you. Each one was written by someone who believed they were noting what was in front of them. The men who removed Enoch from the Bible did not tell us why, in the kind of detail we would want, but they told us this much. They found it too specific, too physical, too willing to point at a spot in the ground and say, there, that is where they are. And maybe that is the whole reason it was buried. Not because it was false, but because it could be checked. And the only question the text leaves you with is not whether any of this was ever real. It is what you will do with the fact that three separate records, from three separate worlds, all describe the same sealed place in the ground, and all of them fall silent at exactly the point where someone would finally have to go down and open the door.